This is Moderate Rebels. I'm Ben Norton with Max Blumenthal, and we are here with a good friend of the show, Aaron Maté, to discuss how Russiagate has completely imploded, as we predicted on this show in 2017.
Our first show.
In your first show? Really? It was the first show? No.
Our first episode, just to say we told you so for a second, not to go too far, but in our first episode in August of 2017, and then when we had Aaron on, that was in October 2017, and as Max and Aaron, to give credit to them, they've been reporting on this issue now obsessively, especially Aaron, for 2 years, and have been vindicated.
Yes, and unfortunately, I mean, one consequence.
I'm vindicated. It's like being acquitted.
Well, exactly. No, but it's like one like the import of the fact that we've been vindicated is the fact that those who were on the opposite side, who were pushing this thing, have handed Donald Trump a massive victory, and that's something we've been warning about for 2 years.
A huge re-election gift. In fact, the biggest re-election gift he could imagine.
Steve Bannon said Trump's going to go full animal now. And
Great.
You can totally imagine how they gamed this out and saw it coming, and now it's it's campaign season. The Democrats don't have a clear contender. Many of them had fully invested in Mueller indicting Trump ahead of the campaign, and I think Trump is the favorite to be reelected. On the other hand, I think that because the Democrats spent 2 years, and this is the Democratic leadership, as you said, Aaron, which has a lot in common with Trump. They're Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, they're wealthy people. They are very close to Wall Street.
I mean, Trump gave money to Chuck Schumer for years.
Yeah. I said from the beginning that the Democrats, at least the Democratic leadership, was doing this because they wanted to oppose Trump without having to do anything genuinely progressive. In other words, to deal with what we call in the U.S. kitchen table issues, but which actually means class issues. And so in a way, this kind of does provide an opening for Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, who are into class issues. That's really at the center of their narrative. Anyway, where do you see it going before we, look back to the Keith Olbermann era when Olbermann was in his little cardboard GQ basement? Like, where do you see this going forward?
Well, where it goes forward, I think people like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, who I think, compared to the rest of the pack, have been relatively restrained. Although, of course, they had to pay lip service, or at least they decided they had to pay lip service to this whole Russiagate thing. But they're going to be in a bit of a box because they can't distance themselves too much from it because they bought into it. And to maintain credibility with the Democratic elite, who they have to, be in partnership with, at least in some respect, they can't throw them under the bus fully. So I think they're a little bit boxed in. And what I'm worried about is that if they pay too much credence to Russiagate still, even though it's now been destroyed, that once they get to the election and go head-to-head with Trump, Trump will be able to box them in and use Russiagate against them. And it'll be hard for them to both distance themselves from it by not throwing the Democratic Party fully under the bus. So it's just one of many catastrophic results of this whole thing from the beginning, including also the fact that now Trump and his GOP allies are going to be using their powers in Congress and the Senate to launch investigations. And the difference between, I think, their investigations and the Mueller investigation is that the investigations into the investigation are going to actually produce some damning stuff.
They're going to investigate the FBI, is what you're saying? I mean,
yeah, because the FBI...
Part of me would welcome that.
Well, and I advocate it because, we should be supporting, accountability for intelligence agencies no matter what the partisan consequences are. Because, of course, those same intelligence agencies who decided to investigate Trump, in part because they didn't like his public embrace of Vladimir Putin, those same agencies, unless they're stopped, could open up an investigation against a candidate who endorses BDS or who...
Against a President Bernie Sanders, which is the ultimate irony of this, is that you had these Bernie Sanders supporters who accepted Russiagate and who advanced it for the past 2 years, and they don't realize that the same tactics that the intelligence agencies are using against Trump could be used against a President Bernie Sanders. Do you think that the FBI would be, and this is the whole nonsense behind this whole democratic socialism discussion, is that they think that the U.S. intelligence agencies that are freaking out about Donald Trump, who is a right-wing billionaire who said a few critical things about NATO, and look how crazy the intelligence agencies got. Imagine if we have someone like Bernie Sanders or someone in the UK like Jeremy Corbyn.
No, it's already happened in the UK.
Exactly.
I just returned from the UK, and I met with our friend Asa Winstanley, who has been suspended without any explanation from the Labour Party, and talking to him, talking to people who are relative political insiders there, like my friend Afshin Ratanzi. They're telling me that Corbyn has already been neutered. He's completely muted about this. One of his biggest pit bulls in the Parliament, in the House of Commons, Chris Williamson, has also been suspended. And the most Kafkaesque part about it is that they're not even allowed to talk publicly about their suspension or why it happened. And they used the fake anti-Semitism scandal to basically engineer a very British coup. Bernie Sanders, if he isn't looking at what just took place with Trump, where confidential operatives of the CIA and FBI, like Stefan Halper, were inserted into the Trump campaign in order to entrap members of Trump's foreign policy team into an intelligence intrigue. If he's not looking at that and seeing that by the time he gets to the White House, if he ever does, his socialist or social democratic agenda will be completely neutered by these same forces, then he's not taking American politics as it is seriously.
Which then returns to the point I was making, which is that, as we go forward now, Trump and his GOP allies are going to be investigating this, and they will come up with damning stuff because, as I've noted for a long time now, the predicate for this whole investigation was not there, and there were seriously shady intelligence decisions like the one that Max just mentioned. Also, the use of the Steele dossier, this DNC-funded, a phony Oppo research document, to get a surveillance warrant on Trump campaign volunteer Carter Page, and citing that the FBI in their application for the FISA warrant said that they believe Page is orchestrating a plot between Moscow and Trump. And their main source of that was the Steele dossier. So things like this are going to come out more and more now and get more attention because Trump has been given this gift, and that will help him in his reelection campaign all the more in his efforts to say he's the victim of a witch hunt.
Michael Isikoff just disowned the Steele dossier on Chris Hayes, I think 2 nights ago. That was really fun to watch. That was sort of the basis of him and David Corn's work. And he said, well, it wasn't true and we all fell for it. Or he blamed Christopher Steele for pushing them too far. But let's stay on this topic a little bit. Let's talk about another Page. How about Lisa Page? You followed what was happening within the FBI during the campaign. Let's stay on this, Aaron. Who else are they going to look at in the FBI? Pete Stroke. We saw him testify, and I thought it was, he was projecting confidence, but there was clearly a lot that he didn't want to discuss. And these were the so-called Russia experts in the FBI who were basically partisan hacks who were trying to take us to where we are today.
Not just partisan hacks, but, fanatic Russophobes. If you look at Lisa Page and Peter Strzok. So Lisa Page is an FBI attorney, and Peter Strzok is an FBI agent. In fact, the lead agent who signed the opening investigation document opening up Crossfire Hurricane, which was the initial FBI probe into Trump and Russia on July 31st, 2016. If you look at their text messages between them, some of which have been released, although not all of them, and you also look at their testimony before Congress, you'll see them say things like Peter Strzok talks about hating the Russians. They're all liars. Lisa Page talks about how Russia is a mortal threat. Russia wants to destroy our way of life. And this is the mindset that animated the decision to open up an investigation of a presidential campaign, because they saw Donald Trump and after he took office too, saying nice things about Vladimir Putin. And we know this now from Andrew McCabe, who's confirmed this, and from reporting in the New York Times, that part of the predicate for opening up a counterintelligence investigation into Trump after he came into power was that they were seeing Trump say nice things about Putin and not criticizing him. They were relying on public developments that were and stories in newspapers that were even false. So not just a public development, but a falsely portrayed development, like the fact that there were some articles claiming that the Republican Party, at Trump's behest, the Trump campaign's behest, changed its meaningless, by the way, platform at the RNC when it comes to Ukraine. I mean, that story this was supposed to be a part of the quid pro quo, according to Chris Steele.
It was obvious when that became the center of the narrative that the whole thing was bogus. I mean,
what actually happened there was just simply basically a delegate proposed. And by the way, this platform means nothing to anybody. It's not as if like party platforms, whether you're the DNC or RNC, these mean anything. But a delegate proposed.
It means a lot to Putin, Aaron.
Okay, right, except for Putin. A delegate proposed an amendment wanting specific language about sending lethal arms to Ukraine to fight Russia. It was softened a little bit, so it was changed to like appropriate assistance to Ukraine. The final RNC platform was far more hawkish on this issue of Ukraine than the DNC platform was. But somehow this was turned into this thing where why did Trump change the platform? And we're still seeing this question posed today by purportedly serious journalists, all of them overlooking the fact that not only is this development misconstrued, that the platform itself is meaningless, but that when Trump actually came into power, what did he do? He actually sold those weapons to Ukraine, something that Obama did not even do.
These were Javelin anti-tank missiles that were produced by Raytheon, and Raytheon was represented by a lobbying firm called I think the BMG Group of Ed Rogers, and that group donated to the McCain Institute. The executive director of the McCain Institute was Kurt Volker, and Kurt Volker was one of the first neocons that Trump appointed as his special envoy to Ukraine, who was basically simultaneously a backdoor lobbyist for Raytheon and engineered the deal for these offensive weapons. And somehow the whole Russiagate crazed media overlooked this, as they overlooked the neocon capture of the Trump administration.
Well, and right now,
and they created space for it in the process, you know.
And right now, today is March 27th. Today, Trump threatened Russia because Russia sent troops at the request of the Venezuelan government. Russia sent probably around 100 troops to Venezuela. And Trump responded saying, Russia needs to leave Venezuela. And Trump said all options are on the table. Of course, implying, it's not going to happen, but implying that the U.S. would militarily intervene using the pretense of Russia sending troops at the request of Venezuela's government. So, and again, every time something like this happens, this is how conspiracy theories work. This counter evidence is taken in this kind of QAnon fashion as proof that the conspiracy is true, because it's this whole four-dimensional chess where Trump is doing this thing that Putin doesn't want because it's a sign that he's actually not. No, I mean, every counter piece of evidence that shows that the conspiracy is false is taken as further evidence that it's true. This is how conspiracy theorists work.
It's because by calling Trump Putin's puppet, he consistently would overcompensate in order to demonstrate that he wasn't. I don't know if you remember when Trump first bombed Syria in April 2017, Donald Trump Jr. said, "This illustrates that Donald Trump Sr., my dad, is not a tool of Russia. In fact, he is as hard on Russia as anyone."
Thank you, Russiagate hacks. Thank you. Thank you for giving us so many wonderful memories.
But the thing is, the Russiagate hacks are also uncoincidentally the same ones who wanted regime change in Syria, the same ones who now want regime change in Venezuela. So actually, this plays into their hands anyway. Even the ostensibly left-wing supporters of Russiagate, which I want to talk about because we need to talk about this political phenomenon, but even many of them were the same so-called leftists who supported regime change in Syria and who supported U.S. support for Ukraine.
It's always the same kind of crowd.
I mean, these are the same. It's the State Department socialists. It's the Cold Warriors who claim to be on the left, but are just Cold Warriors, even though the Cold War has already been defeated.
This was one of the first points that I remember Max Blumenthal making. When Max first talked about this issue, I remember him calling this whole Russiagate thing a scam. It was in one of our first interviews on the topic. And what you also said was that Russiagate was a way for neocons and other adherents to the bipartisan foreign policy consensus in Washington to basically repackage their Cold War hawkish views into a mirage of being under the guise of being an anti-Trump resistance, when really it was a neocon agenda in a liberal guise.
Yeah, let's talk about that. I mean, the neocons should have been discredited with the war in Iraq. There's just kind of a consensus that it was a huge mistake. But they've, if you actually look really closely at what they were doing before the war in Iraq, I actually went back, and this will be in the afterword of my book, which might be out by the time this podcast comes out.
The management of savagery.
Yeah, which is that there were a series of letters that were actually authored, I think, under National Endowment for Democracy letterhead, calling on President Bush to George W. Bush to push harder on Russia, to support the looming color revolutions, and to essentially implement a policy of regime change against Moscow. Bipartisan signers, everyone from the project. It was basically the Project for a New American Century, including people like Tom Malinowski, who went on to be a director at Human Rights Watch and is now a member of Congress in New Jersey. But if you actually go back to the 70s, when the neocons were born out of the office of Senator Scoop Jackson, who was a Democrat, this is where Wolfowitz and Richard Pearl come from. They were really obsessed with Russia partly because of the issue of Soviet Jewry. Joshua Moravchik, also known as Joshua Apparatchik, who is a major neoconservative figure in Washington who's still bouncing around, he was heavily involved in the issue of Soviet Jewry, getting the Jews out of the Soviet Union and getting them into Israel to fight the demographic trench war against the Palestinians, which they eventually succeeded on that. In the 80s, the neocons formed Team B in the Reagan administration to push for higher defense budgets, to try to stifle Reagan's attempts, which actually, provide a good backdrop for what Trump attempted to do with Putin. But Reagan's attempt to sign treaties on nuclear missiles, including the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which Trump has abandoned. And Reagan threw them out of the administration. The neocons went into the wilderness in the Clinton administration. That's when they formed the Project for a New American Century. And then, with the unipolar post-Cold War order, they embarked on this project of regime change across the globe, color revolutions. And all of that kind of came crashing to a halt with the Trump era, with the defeat of Hillary Clinton. And it collided with Russiagate, and Russiagate gave them a way back into their original home, which is the Democratic Party. And the Democratic fake, AstroTurf grassroots welcomed them back in. They, what we could call the liberal media, Rachel Maddow, Lawrence O'Donnell, all these figures, the resistance, welcomed them back in because these people were kind of considered experts on this issue, and they knew how to manipulate it. So David Frum goes to Hollywood, and he gets Rob Reiner and Morgan Freeman to create this front group. Bill Kristol sets up all of these Russiagate front groups, and they're all directed against Trump. So the Democrats are like, great, we have, Republican allies. And remember, during the Clinton campaign, she had Max Boot in a commercial. She gave a speech saying, we welcome honorable Republicans like John McCain. David Frum wrote the conservative case for Hillary Clinton. This all happened in 2016, and it came together with Russiagate. And it was one of the most dangerous and upsetting developments in post 9/11 political history. After everything that happened, these fuckers came back.
And we can't understand it without understanding the major political contradiction going on within the Democratic Party is that you have this insurgent left-wing movement, and there are a few ways to attack them. So one of the major ways which we see in the United Kingdom is the fake anti-Semitism scandal, which they also been using against Ilhan Omar, because if you criticize Israeli apartheid, then you're smeared as anti-Semitic, and you can use that as a way to discredit any criticism of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, of U.S. imperialism in general, because you can just say that, oh, you're anti-American, if you criticize Israel, you're anti-Semitic, you support terrorists. They've been using this tactic for years, and that's a way to discredit anyone on the anti-war left. And then internally, the way you can push back against the progressive left that is a threat to the same Democrats who welcomed in the neoconservatives is by using Russiagate. And it's not a coincidence that the same week that Russiagate collapsed, we also saw a report in the past few days that the DCCC has announced that it will cut business ties with any firms that support candidates that are primarying sitting incumbent Democrats. So what they're essentially saying, without saying it explicitly, is that any progressives who are trying to primary and unseat neoliberal corporate Democrats, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez did to Crowley, anyone who does something similar, they're going to have their business relations severed completely perpetually with the DCCC. So again, we have seen that after 2 years, Russiagate has been used as this political weapon to attack anyone on the left who's mildly critical of U.S. imperialism, of U.S. foreign policy, and trying to prevent the anti-war left from gaining any traction. And 2 years later, even though it has completely collapsed, even though they gave a huge gift to Trump, they're doubling down again, and they're still saying, the DCCC announced this after the Mueller report. So we keep seeing that they're going to use any tactics they can to prevent an anti-war left from emerging. And that's what Max was just articulating, is that they're willing to ally with so-called moderate Republicans, which are just the moderate rebels of the U.S. They're willing to ally with these neoconservatives against the anti-war left, because as Jamie Kirchick and others wrote during the presidential campaign in 2016, we are the useful idiots of Trump, as he libeled numerous people, including Ronnie Akalik, anyone who's on the left who criticizes U.S. foreign policy and who has anti-war politics is smeared in this way, which is what Russiagate has been for the past 2 years.
The tell for liberals and leftists should have been, what these neocons and Republican hawks were opposing Trump over. They weren't opposing him because he's a misogynist or a racist or, a corrupt billionaire. They were opposing him because on the campaign trail, he was rhetorically challenging the neocon Cold War consensus. I think not because he really believes in anything, but just because he had his eye on the pulse. He saw that in the parts of the country that mattered, there was a strong anti-war sentiment in part, and there's an important study that showed this. There was a correlation between support for Trump and countries where military sacrifice was highest, i.e.
States.
In states where military sacrifice was highest, i.e. where people were dying the most from fighting in foreign wars. And so Trump saw that, and I think he took advantage of it. I think Trump, to explain Trump's warm words for Putin, I think it's quite plausible. The best explanation I have is that, as Michael Cohen recently testified, Trump never thought he would win, but he saw the campaign trail as a branding opportunity, and we know he wanted to build a tower in Moscow. And so the campaign was a great way to promote that, But I think if that's true, then of course it undermines the idea that there was some kind of conspiracy between Trump and Russia, when really he was just using it as a marketing opportunity to appeal to Russia, which actually in real life didn't even work out because he never got to build the tower there, and it never even came close. And the thing is, when we talk about the media failure, right, it's not. We can mock CNN and MSNBC all day. Literally, you could write books and books and books about how insane they were, and we've done plenty of that. So I don't think we need to spend time on that. But we need to talk about how many of our leftist colleagues bought into this Russia thing early on. And I've made this point before.
Leftist.
Well, no, listen. Like for example, I think I mentioned this.
Yeah, let's name some names.
Well,
here,
again, like to illustrate, I mentioned this. I believe I mentioned the same headline the first time I came on your podcast, and I'll do it again. This is Democracy Now!, September 16, 2016. So even before Trump won, this is a headline from Democracy Now! Kurt Eichenwald on how Trump organizations. I'm gonna start again because you guys are laughing.
Wait, by the way, all I'll say is if people don't know who Kurt Eichenwald is, don't look up Kurt Eichenwald octopus porn.
Tentacle, isn't it tentacle porn?
Tentacle porn, yeah. Don't look up octopus porn either. But go ahead, Aaron.
So this is Democracy Now! And full disclosure, I worked there for 10 years. This is like the preeminent leftist show, and it has a noble legacy that I'm proud to be a part of. But this just illustrates how far this goes. I'm not saying this to single DN out because they were among many, but just the fact that this is the leading leftist show, and this is a headline in DN, September 16, 2016. Kurt Eichenwald on how Trump organizations' links to Russia could threaten U.S. security. So this was bought into early on.
Well, Democracy Now! Has consistently been concerned about U.S. security. That's a big part of the show's plank.
Exactly. So, and the fact that they're peddling that line and adopting rhetoric, national security state rhetoric like that, just shows how from the beginning, so many people did not see the scam for what it was. And so when we talk now about a media reckoning for the failure, it's not just MSNBC. It's everybody. It's Democracy Now! It's The Intercept. It's some of my colleagues at The Nation. It's Mother Jones, obviously, and Max, that you've had a lot to say about Mother Jones.
Mother Jones not on the left anymore, and actually, I've been meaning to write about this, but Craig Newmark, who is the guy who founded Craigslist, who's kind of functioning a lot like Pierre Omidyar and doing all these weird partnerships with, U.S. soft power groups, has donated $1 million to Mother Jones in his name, in his words, to wage an information war against Russia. Mother Jones has just been like the absolute. It's basically reads like a CIA newsletter or something. I mean,
it's up there with Rachel Maddow with complete abject conspiracies. And for people watching and not just listening, I'll put up an image here of a cover of Mother Jones. It has Trump standing below Putin, and then it says Puppet Master with arrows pointing to Putin. That was a cover of the print edition of Mother Jones, and it was also, for a few months, it was the header image on their Twitter account. The header image on the Mother Jones Twitter account was Putin holding Trump like a puppet. This is named after Mother Jones, who was a radical union organizer, a revolutionary, a socialist, and she's rolling in her grave. It's just so crazy.
Well, I mean, here's another issue for Mother Jones is that, New Knowledge, which is the Democratic, the Democratic data hustlers who went down to Alabama and ran one of the worst black propaganda campaigns ever to actually depress Republican votes. They said they ran a Russia-style disinformation campaign in their own words, and the New York Times kind of covered up for it until they eventually covered it. But one of the things they did was they took some like lawnmower salesman or something who was running a third-party campaign as a right-winger. They tried to boost him. And so this data firm actually arranged a series of interviews and media for this unknown lawnmower salesman to kind of undercut Judge Roy Moore. And one of the articles that New Knowledge produced was in Mother Jones. It's basically Mother Jones became part of a Russian-style disinformation operation, where another thing they did was, as most of our viewers will know, or like our hardcore base will know, they were involved in the purchase of bots for Roy Moore with Cyrillic names so they could say that Russia was boosting Roy Moore. Actually, that's what Mother Jones reported on, that Russia was boosting Roy Moore because this firm bought these bots for Roy Moore's Twitter account. And Mother Jones still has that article up. And if you click on that article, there's a banner ad above it with David Korn telling you to donate more money to Mother Jones so they can keep doing more of this kind of work. Then you've got Think Progress and the Moscow Project, which is all based on it's all based on the Steele dossier, and this was like Neera Tanden's little Potemkin Village hustle.
By the way, Max, you're skipping the fact that New Knowledge was also contracted by the Senate to write the definitive report about Russian social media interference.
Right, about the Internet Research Agency, which was then hyped up in the New York Times.
And both of you forgot to mention that New Knowledge is this grifting group that was created by former U.S. national security state operatives who were working for the NSA and Army intelligence. And then, like many of these people who realize it's a hustle, they can leave the U.S. national security state and make 4 to 5 times as much money if they just go into the private sector and make these fake cybersecurity groups. And they get tons of money now. Like, how much did they get paid for the Senate from the Senate?
That's
then
a good
there's
question.
Hamilton 68, which is operated under the auspices of the German Marshall Fund, which is funded by NATO and USAID. And this is one of the main groups that the New York Times and all the Scott Shane, this is one of the worst culprits at the New York Times, writing these articles about Russian bots and how they were tricking Americans into like taking a knee at NFL games to divide us. And it was just a gigantic black propaganda campaign. It was a disinformation operation run by spooks and national security state retreads who were just like carpetbagging their way across the states looking for new contracts, and Russiagate just came along after the war on terror and fed them all of this money, and they fed the press all of these lies about Russian bots dividing us. And, we haven't explored that yet. This has very little to do with the Mueller report. In fact, one of the fallbacks for the people who are humiliated by the Mueller report's, I wouldn't say release, but by its conclusion that there was no collusion, is that, oh, well, Russia did interfere in our elections, so we still have that. And Mueller proved that. And Mueller did prove that a private troll farm in St. Petersburg owned by a hot dog salesman actually did swing votes to Donald Trump that may have been decisive in Michigan because, they were taking out Facebook pages with Buff Bernie coloring book LGBTQ themed pages. I mean, they're still falling back on that, Aaron.
Yeah.
What about that? That narrative is going to be there. It's not going away.
Yeah, I mean,
the disinformation is not going away.
No, it's not. So I have 2 points to say here. One, so New Knowledge was the primary report. There was another report, but New Knowledge was the primary one, and it was cited by everybody. Fueled, headlines for days about how the Senate report shows the extent of the Russian social media attack. And I wrote a piece for The Nation, sort of going through it and looking at what it showed and how actually the number of social media posts by the IRA, only a very small number of them even talked about the election or about the candidates.
Facebook admitted, the VP of Facebook published a report that admitted that the majority of the ads came out after the election.
Oh, of course. Oh, yeah, after the election. Oh, yeah. I mean, the whole thing is like, to even discuss it, it feels silly because it's so stupid. But I'm going to quote you one thing from the New Knowledge report in case anybody missed this. This is my favorite part of it. So New Knowledge in this section, this is a Senate report. Okay, this has the imprimatur of the U.S. Senate. So they have a section on the Russians, quote, asset development, and it says, quote, recruiting an asset by exploiting a personal vulnerability is a timeless espionage practice. Okay, and the first example they adduce of this timeless espionage practice is this. There's an ad of Jesus comforting a sullen young man, and you see Jesus quoted saying, struggling with the addiction to masturbation, reach out to me and we will beat it together. And then it says, you can't hold hands with God when you are masturbating. Use our hotline if you need help. So according to the official Senate experts on, Russian espionage and Russian interference, this was the top example of the Russians' asset development as part of their sweeping social media campaign that, of course, sober people like Gerald Nadler and Hillary Clinton compared to Pearl Harbor and 9/11. And speaking of Hillary Clinton...
What a bunch of jerk-offs.
And speaking of Hillary Clinton, in terms of the ads, and this speaks to a major reason why we have Russiagate, is Hillary Clinton was quoted saying, when there was a big uproar about Cambridge Analytica, whether or not the Trump campaign was involved and whether or not the Russians were involved with them, Hillary Clinton said, there are questions about how did the Russians know to target their sophisticated ads to voters in Wisconsin and Michigan?
How did they know? Because she wasn't campaigning there? I don't know.
Well, exactly. So it's like you're going to blame these stupid Russian ads that nobody saw for your failure in the states you didn't campaign in because, according to the book Shattered, Hillary didn't campaign there because her aides told her that the more attention we raise about you there, the worse we'll do because voters reject your message. These were 2 states that Bernie Sanders won during the primary because the voters there rebelled against against Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama's neoliberal legacy. And of course, in the election, what do we see? They went for Trump because Trump was falsely portraying himself as a working class champion who was going to drain the swamp.
And the Clinton legacy of sending their jobs overseas through NAFTA was fresh in everybody's minds, and she was running on that legacy. She was talking about doing more TPP and so on. And
so her and her cohorts are blaming these stupid ads that nobody saw for their loss. Like, is there a parallel in terms of like self-denial and delusion? There's no other parallel in my lifetime. And that's why I was saying the other day, like, you can't understand this whole thing without like talking about psychology, and I'm not like equipped enough to talk about that yet, but I'd like to look at that one day because it's like it was the biggest outbreak of collective self-delusion that I personally have ever witnessed.
Well, since WMDs in Iraq.
Well, in many ways, it's about a collapsing empire. The Republicans have Iran. They have Muslims as the internal threat. and the Democrats needed an external threat to consolidate a base that was sort of collapsing, and an internal threat that brought everyone together and united their base in paranoia. It's the same thing the Republicans have done since 9/11. It's the same thing that they did during the Cold War. And the Democrats, had Russians as their internal creeping Sharia and external, Al-Qaeda, Iran, Hezbollah, any bearded guy you can think of with olive skin. And that's what it is.
In the words of Rachel Maddow, in a segment where she was talking about alleged Russian trolls doing some activity on the Facebook page for Bernie Sanders fans in San Diego, okay? That was the topic. She says, this is international warfare against our country.
Yeah, and it's always the Russians that they refer to. They're never exactly talking about, the Kremlin necessarily, but it's the Russians, which means that every Russian is connected in one way or another to not just the Kremlin, but to some intelligence intrigue, that they're all potential spies.
And this was reflected in the reporting. The New York Times and Washington Post both did stories about the Russians linked to Trump's campaign, and they included people who were like musicians, bodybuilders, they're Russians that maybe have like 3 degrees of separation or something, but the actual reports were about the Trump campaign's links to, quote, Russian nationals, not to Russian government workers, not to the Kremlin. And what's really crazy in terms
well, then
of
it became Ukrainians, Ben.
Yeah,
including
Ukrainian oligarchs.
Including Victor Pinchuk, who had paid Trump for a speech, but was also a major Clinton funder and a funder of the Atlantic Council. I mean, just because he's Ukrainian.
Well, and then there were reports about Russian oligarchs, and it's like, oops, they were Ukrainian oligarchs, but they're all the same. And on this point, though, what I was going to say is that what's even more insulting and the intense hypocrisy is that in Iran, when you have the so-called hardliners, because there aren't hardliners here, when you have people in Iran who have the slogan, Death to America, they're not talking about Americans. They're talking about death to the American government. The Houthis do the same thing in Yemen. But then when Americans hear that, they freak out and they're like, oh my God, they want to kill us. And it's like, no, they don't. They're not conflating Americans with their own government. They're able to distinguish the two, unlike you all who conflate all Russians with their government. It's the peak of imperial hubris and hypocrisy where they pretend like people in the global south are all barbarians who are unable to distinguish their governments from the citizens, whereas here in the imperial metropole, actually, people do conflate average Russians and average Iranians and average Venezuelans with their government.
Yeah, I mean, just to pick up on what Ben was saying, there was like reporting by the New York Times and the Washington Post about literally how many times people in Trump's orbit spoke to someone who might have had a Russian passport. I mean, that
was a Russian national was the language.
To illustrate this again, I'm going back to Democracy Now, and I'm not trying to single out DN because they were not the only one, but they are a leading and noble left show. Okay, this is a headline: Who is Maria Butina? The story of accused Russian spy who infiltrated the NRA before the 2016 election. So Maria Butina was not an accused Russian spy. She's just a Russian. And she's really into guns, and she happened to be trying to curry links with people in the NRA. And basically, there was a great piece recently by James Bamford in the New Republic that basically destroys the entire narrative about Maria Butina, this idea she was a spy. Of course, there were all these claims made by prosecutors and picked up and repeated everywhere, including on Democracy Now!, that she was offering sex in exchange for access. All this bullshit. And basically, and she's still sitting in prison right now. And basically, if you look at the actual details,
she's been in solitary for a lot of that period.
Yeah. And if you look at the details, read this James Bamford piece. Her crime basically is carrying a Russian passport and being in the U.S. at a time when pretty much the entire political and media class had mainstreamed Russophobia.
It's really blatant racism, and the only other country I can think of where we see something similar is on Iran, where you see people like Lindsey Graham and others who made all these comments about how you can't trust Iranians because Iranians are deceptive.
Oh yeah, it's the culture of the bazaar. That's what they always say. And they're going to hustle you. With Russians, we had James Clapper saying that they're genetically predisposed to cheat and lie. Now, James Clapper, Aaron, let's I want to like kind of talk about Russiagate as a convergence of the Clinton dead enders, and I'm glad you brought up Hillary Clinton and blaming her catastrophic failure on Russia. It's interesting that she, by the way, hasn't tweeted about Mueller since the report came out. Hasn't said a word about it. I hope she just never says a word again and just disappears into the ether, because that's what justice requires for what she's done to this country.
By the way, parenthetically, I also haven't seen one of the biggest Russiagate peddlers, Adam Schiff, who said that there was more than circumstantial evidence of collusion. I could be wrong. I haven't seen him do one sit-down interview since Mueller's finding came out.
That fucking lying turtle. He looks like a lying turtle. That's just
he's the
coming
Democratic
out of
Mitch
suit.
McConnell.
I wanted to make one point just in terms of
let me.
All right.
You talked about Russiagate as a convergence of Clinton dead enders and spooks like James Clapper who went into the media. So I think we should talk about how it came together and how dangerous that is at some point here.
Yeah. Let me make a quick point, just picking up on what we were talking about before in terms of the Russophobia. One critical aspect of Russiagate and why that illustrates how the evidence was never there for the Trump-Russia conspiracy that everybody was so convinced of, and illustrates the fact that all the available evidence, in fact, undermined the probability of a conspiracy, that all these people who are presented to us publicly as being Kremlin agents or intermediaries between Trump and Russia, Mueller never directly accused anyone of that. It was basically just pundits and politicians using their imaginations to turn whoever knew a Russian or might have had a Russian passport or talked to a Russian into a possible Kremlin agent. And I want to hone in on this because in Attorney General Barr's summary of Mueller's report, he never says that Trump individuals spoke to Trump he never says that Trump associates or figures spoke to Russian government agents or intermediaries. He says he talks about offers from Russian affiliated individuals. Okay, so the term to describe the people who Trump spoke to are Russian affiliated individuals. What does it mean? What does it mean to be Russian affiliated? I mean, if any of them had any ties to the Russian government, wouldn't you say Russian government agents, Russian government tied agents? No, it's Russian affiliated individuals. So affiliated can basically mean someone who claims to have an affiliation in some sense to Russia, or who might have spoken to someone who knows someone who has a Russian government passport. And so on that evidentiary issue, it's just one aspect of how this whole thing got overblown. So anyway, that was a digression.
Well, and on that note, we even saw that in at least the summary of the Mueller report released by Barr, and a quick point on this, there are all these Russiagate apologists and defenders who keep saying, oh, so now you trust the Trump-appointed Attorney General Barr? And it's like, wait, so do you think that Barr is incapable of using quotation marks correctly? Because he quotes from the Mueller report.
He's right. That's right.
Do you think he intentionally misquoted or whatever? So that's a ridiculous talking point. But
or that Mueller would stay silent after actually breaking his silence when BuzzFeed published a completely false and still unretracted report. Do you think Mueller and his team would just allow all their work to go to waste?
It's just a new conspiracy theory to cover up for the failure of the first one. That's all it is.
Of course.
And and then on William Barr, I mean, who is this guy? He's not he's not Sebastian Gorka or Sheriff Dave Clark. Remember him?
Sheriff Clark, yes.
He's kind of fell off. But, William Barr is the guy who made the legal case for the U.S. assault on Panama, which actually set the stage for the first Gulf War in a lot of ways. The testing of the B-2 stealth bomber, etc. William Barr was a key figure in Iran-Contra and writing pardons for Iran-Contra figures. He's the establishment through and through. He's the national security state. I believe, and I have no real evidentiary basis for saying this, that if Donald Trump had actually resisted the neocon tide, if he had never appointed John Bolton, who sabotaged the Korea peace talks, who is pushing this coup in Venezuela, if Trump had actually gone forward after the summit with Putin and not broken the INF treaty and relieved sanctions on Russia and started moving forward towards a more peaceful future, if he had gotten his Nobel Prize out of Korea, et cetera, and pulled troops all the way out of Syria, I don't think Mueller, and if he hadn't appointed William Barr, I don't think Mueller would have been as sympathetic to him, as favorable to him. I have no basis for saying that. It just seems like everybody got what they wanted out of Donald Trump with this Russiagate thing, including the forces that Mueller and William Barr represent. Everybody's kind of happy except for the, real whack job liberals who went along with this.
Yeah, I mean, and getting to James Clapper, who you mentioned, Max, I mean, their role here has to be heavily scrutinized, and the liberals who worship them have to really rethink what just happened. So, John Brennan, the CIA director, by his own account, he played a major role in getting the Trump-Russia investigation going, and he certainly stoked the prevailing suspicions about Trump and Russia when he said things like accusing Trump of being treasonous, right? And he talked about seeing worrying evidence, and now all of a sudden and he does this, by the way, from the perch of being hired as an analyst on MSNBC, while his counterpart on CNN is James Clapper, the former head of national intelligence. And now, after the Mueller report comes out, Brennan came out this week, just a few weeks after he predicted a flurry of indictments to end Mueller's probe. He said that Trump figures would get indicted for the actual conspiracy. Now John Brennan comes out and says, I might have been given bad information.
Yeah, I might have just called him a traitor and been given bad information.
Yeah. Well, and then the implication of this is the implications are difficult to overstate. We've made this point on our show before, but multiple people, including leading Democratic politicians, compared the supposed Russian hacking in the favor of Trump, which we know is BS. They compared it to Pearl Harbor. And this is the point that Max has made before on the show. What was the response to Pearl Harbor? It was to enter a war, a global war. Yeah. So if you truly believe that the supposed Russian hacking of the election was equivalent, tantamount, or worse than Pearl Harbor, some people have said it's actually the worst incident in U.S. history. It's worse than Pearl Harbor. Then the only rational response to that, to an incident tantamount to Pearl Harbor, would be to launch a war on Russia. And I actually, as crazy as it sounds, I truly think there are some cold warriors in the U.S. government, in both the Democratic and Republican parties, who would be fine with that. They actually would be fine with a war with Russia.
Or some war on the frontiers of Russia.
And to illustrate just how pervasive this is across the spectrum, the top example that comes to mind for me is David Cleon, a liberal writer. He also writes at The Nation. Didn't he call this on Twitter the crime of the century?
Yeah.
Who?
And by the way, he's not just...
Sorry, who is that?
Don't worry about it. But the point is
sorry, I don't live in Brooklyn anymore, so I don't know who these people are.
Well, we need to get out of here, Aaron. But no, but important point, correction. He would correct you. He's not a liberal. He's a self-declared socialist. And this is the point I was making. We should talk about this, about what you would call the State Department socialists, the pro-imperialist socialists who sided with Russiagate. And it's consistent. It's not new. It's because, again, they've towed the party line on Syria, on Libya, and all these. And then Russiagate came, and David Cleon was among several others, Ryan Cooper and these others. David Cleon was writing articles in The Guardian berating the left, saying, why isn't the left taking Russian interference more seriously? This is an important issue. He said in his Guardian article attacking the left for not accepting this Russian collusion narrative, he said, there's a growing consensus among U.S. spy agencies, is the quote. And we saw this coterie of self-declared socialists who now get all of these great profiles in New York Magazine. David Cleon was one
because
of
they
the
have
people.
Drinks with Kirsten Gillibrand at Blue and Gold or
they
whatever.
All hang out. They hang out at
that bar
bars.
Sucks. They pour out shots like they measure the shots. Like they don't just pour them out. That bar. Anyway.
Anyway.
Yeah. What about that guy Jeet here? I don't know. He's like the comic book Canadian guy who's now like leading the New Republic, which is some sort of glorified version of the Baffler, but not as good. And he was like, the left needs to be tough on Putin. Like, what the hell? What can we practically do as American left-wingers to be tough on Putin?
Support sanctions is what they mean.
Yes, let's sanction.
Yeah, support war. Support, sending, arms to the Azov battalion in the Donbass. Like, What are we supposed to do?
Armed Ukrainian Nazis.
Ben, what you're getting at, we need to make this elemental point.
Quick historical point. It's not new. There has always been this this coterie, this class of self-declared socialists, of social democrats throughout the Cold War who were allowed to operate within liberal media. They were always the gatekeepers on the left of liberal media who supported the Vietnam War, or at least didn't come out against it. You know, the people who supported the war in Korea, who supported the Bay of Pigs invasion. In fact, you know, one of the people who did this was Michael Harrington, who is the founder of DSA. And we don't need to get into all of that, but the point is that there were all of these publications like the New Republic, like Dissent magazine.
Ben, let me interject. Go back to the New Republic in the run-up to the war in Iraq, or during the war in Iraq, and read Peter Beinart's piece on, you know, a muscular liberalism, and how we need to go back to the days of the Americans for Democratic Action, which was a pro-Vietnam War group of democratic socialists, and be that. And Peter Beinart, when I went on Tucker Carlson back in 2017, you know, before, you know, it was illegal to go on his show, basically because, you know, I wanted to go on a show with a nationwide audience and say why Russiagate is dangerous. I would have preferred to go on some, you know, MSNBC show because I wanted to address also people who are left-wingers. And Peter Beinart wrote this long attack piece on me, just basically about how I was wrong and how we need to take this seriously. And, you know, Peter Beinart's apologized for all of what he said about how we need to support the war in Iraq and how everyone who's against it are surrender monkeys and traitors. But he still has that mentality. You know, that mentality is baked in to a section of what passes for the left in the U.S., which would actually be center-right in any other, you know, country. So you're right, Ben.
Well, and another name to mention here is Mark Cooper of The Nation. Mark Cooper wrote all these pieces
Cooper, that's a name from the past.
Yeah, he was like, I'm the leftist and I oppose the Iraq war, but all these evil tankies, he was writing in The Nation attacking the Answer Coalition for leading the anti-war movement against the Iraq war. He did the same thing against Hugo Chavez as a dictator. There's always been like these respectable gatekeeping leftists who are pro-imperialist, but they're allowed to operate within mainstream media.
He was like a Trotskyist who was kind of like, he was like, you know, like this blister on Hitchens' toe.
I mean, here's the problem. I think we could hack pundits all day. I want to say one more thing.
These aren't hack pundits, though. It's more of an ideological strain within the American left. But
so by the way, I think Glenn Greenwald recently pointed out that on that thing about Tucker Carlson, that Beinart wrote a glowing profile of Tucker Carlson not too long ago about how great he was for dialogue, which is really funny. But you know, Ryan,
because he wanted to go on the show because he's an opportunist. But go ahead.
But Ryan Cooper of The Week. And this is why I want to turn this into a constructive moment. So we're not just dissing people, but we're actually doing something constructive. So I want to issue right now a PSA to pundits like Ryan Cooper and others who fashion themselves as being on the left and who have, I think, solid progressive domestic politics when it comes to domestic politics, I stress. Is you don't have to cater to the bipartisan foreign policy consensus that attacks progressive ideals all around the world in order to bolster your credentials for your progressive views here at home. And in fact, if anything, it undermines them, as exemplified by your embrace of Russiagate. I'm speaking about Ryan Cooper specifically, who recently attacked me on Twitter, so I looked up some of his writings. And not too long ago, he was writing stuff like this. One fairly simple argument is beginning to seem more and more plausible that Putin has dirt on Trump and is using it to manipulate him. And he, one of the examples one piece of evidence he adduces for that.
I love how he writes it like an SAT essay. You know, it's like Putin has dirt on Trump and may be using it. Everybody else is like compromat, but he writes like.
One thing he adduces is he says the way Trump behaves around Putin, quietly bowing and scraping, taking his word over America's own chief of intelligence, and thus inciting backlash even from Republicans, is simply wildly out of character. So it's sort of treating politics as an ice skating performance, looking at his mannerisms. And then he says, I strongly suspect that over the next 6 months to a year, Russiagate will become a greater source of public attention and therefore a decent potential vulnerability for Trump. So not only is this stupid because, I mean, you're looking at things like Trump's mannerisms instead of his actual mannerisms, instead of his actual policies, which meanwhile are escalating tensions with Putin and taking us to the precipice of a really dangerous new Cold War.
Well, and he's not listening to his intelligence chief. And you know what he is? He's the chief of intelligence, which means he's the most intelligent chief in the world.
Yeah.
He's intelligent, you know.
Yeah.
No suspicion of the CIA has ever been allowed here.
But also on
Wait,
top
this
of
is the
all,
point I was
on top
making
of
about-
all that, if I
Who
can
was it?
finish
Dan Coates? Dan Coates is an intelligent guy. Get the fuck out of here. That guy was a lobbyist and the governor of Indiana, or senator from Indiana. He's not intelligent. He doesn't know shit about foreign policy.
Well, and this is the point I was saying about what State Department socialism is. And this is the point. These people aren't just hacks. The point I was making is that there is a class that is allowed to operate within corporate media because they are the gatekeepers who are the ones who say, okay, we are socialists, but NATO is never questionable. Maybe we're not going to be openly pro-NATO, but you can never question the fact that NATO should exist. You can never question the fact that other institutions like the World Bank and IMF should continue to exist. The idea of withdrawing from them is just so taboo and it's just loony. And they're the gatekeepers who are the ones who make sure that yes, you can be a socialist, but only if you respect our intelligence chiefs. And if you don't respect our intelligence chiefs, you are a crazy tanky, you're a conspiracy theorist, you are in the Red-Brown Alliance who are trying to discredit our democratic framework and help the far right destroy democracy.
Yeah. And so, and in terms of Russiagate here, and in terms of what Ryan Cooper is arguing there, getting to what one of the major consequences of this. So in buying into this, in sort of taking advantage of the incentives that Russiagate offered, because if you peddled it, that means you could be taken seriously, quote unquote, by the mainstream. Because if you rejected it, you were on the fringe. But in doing so, and in promoting this idea of a Trump-Russia conspiracy and that this was a big issue and was going to get Trump, you have just helped hand Trump a massive re-election gift. And that is one of the reasons why those who would accuse people like me and Max of defending Trump because we didn't believe he engaged in a conspiracy with Russia had it backwards. That those same people who were saying that were actually the ones who were preparing to give Trump a very massive re-election gift, and they've just delivered it. So I'm no longer referring to Russiagate proponents as Russiagate conspiracy theorists or Russiagate peddlers or whatever else. I'm also calling them Trump re-election gift wrappers because they helped wrap a massive gift that's been handed to Trump heading into 2020.
Yes, Peter Beinart called me Trump's defender on the left. And Peter, where's your mea culpa? Come on. You just gave Trump the biggest gift horse ever. Not you, but all of these people. And now we should talk about, the media and where it goes. And Margaret Sullivan wrote this hilarious piece in the Washington Post about how people like us, but she didn't name us, she named Matt Taibbi and Glenn Greenwald, are being mean to the media, and they shouldn't submit to this bullying from people who've been marginalized all this time, who are actually more talented than the rest of them. Where do you think this is coming from, Aaron, this kind of fear? And do you feel like this vindication is going to last because you and us were mentioned in places we don't usually get positive mentions, like Axios and Vanity Fair? Do you think that you'll be listened to more, or will be listened to, and why do you and how do you think the media that got it wrong is going to respond?
Well, we're already seeing no accountability. I mean, I mentioned Ryan Cooper, but I've also seen other people come after me. Dave Weigel of the Washington Post, Greg Sargent of the Washington Post. Although, in Greg Sargent's defense, I started it, but anyway. But the point is,
these are like badges of honor, by the way.
Yeah, sure, yeah. But like we're seeing no accountability whatsoever because, one lesson of all this is that so much of journalism, unfortunately, is not just about journalism anymore. Like I think maybe one time when Cy Hirsch was plying his trade, could maybe say it was. It's about your credibility is intertwined with how much you cater to the power structure and how much you operate within the constraints that it imposes. And because Russiagate was promoted and propagated so widely across the power structure, those of us who challenged it were kept to the margins. And I think, we also on the left have to talk about, fine, it's fine to call out those who cater to it, but then there are many people who also stayed quiet and are only coming out now and saying that they thought it was all phony.
Like who? I mean, I saw like Naomi Klein was on Scahill's show today talking about Russiagate. Am I wrong?
That's right. No, Naomi
Where the hell
Klein,
where the hell has she been all this time?
Well,
I mean, except for talking about petropopulism in Venezuela, like where I haven't heard much from her. And
yeah,
I've always been a fan of her work. So.
I've always been a fan too, and I've been a friend of hers going back many years. I used to work for her actually, and she's helped me out a lot during my career. But and I can say personally that I reached out to her, over a year ago at least, and asked her, said, "Hey, are you going to weigh in on this? Because I think this is really toxic for the left." And I haven't followed everything she said, but I'm pretty sure she never said basically anything. And so it's strange to see people like Naomi. I mean, I'm happy she's saying it now, but it's like, where were you during the time when it was still going? And what it really is the use of saying it now that it's collapsed? And I think
maybe she was shook for never being around when the beef cooked, as Mobb Deep said. She was afraid people had to be taken seriously as they had to be during the run-up to the war in Iraq, and those who had something on the line just simply stayed silent. And
I'd love to hear.
I haven't had the same opportunities presented to me as she has, so I don't know what it's like.
By the way, Max just took a page out of Ari Melber's playbook in citing rap lyrics.
I was just about to say so
congratulations, Max, for joining the Ari Melber club. But anyway, that's a digression. But yeah, and
I did it exactly like Ari does too.
Or Eli Lake does that too.
Well, I don't know. I'm glad I haven't seen that. Yeah, but so I'd love to hear from people like Naomi.
We're bringing a woke Bill Crystal on soon.
Look that up if you haven't seen that, folks. Woke Bill Crystal by Ari Melber.
All right, we'll play a clip of it here, actually.
Play the clip.
This was the year that many people began referring to woke Bill Crystal, a tribute to the idea that people do evolve, and Trumpism, like a lot of challenges, can create strange bedfellows. And we learned this isn't just for political junkies. Fat Joe told me his fans now approach him to ask about Bill Crystal, and they clearly clicked when we had them back on the show together, and Joe taught woke Bill about what it means to be lit. Well, tonight, for the first time, we can show you that is no joke. Here is some homemade footage of, yes, Fat Joe, you see right there, and Bill Crystal cruising the streets of Manhattan. I got to spend some time with them. We were heading there to an MSNBC event. I actually asked them about the public interest in their relationship and what it might even mean for America.
I'm struck how much people overly almost like are excited or value, someone talking across the aisle or different people getting together to show that you can have a civilized discussion.
When we come on your show, you're like, you broke the ice, and like people love to see it. Like, because I don't think nobody ever seen a pairing like this, talking about political issues and stuff like that.
Trump's brought us together. It's a tribute to Trump.
And there's actually a larger truth there. Trump brought them together. His attempts at division have actually united many.
Okay, so that was Ari Melber and Fat Joe bobbing their heads in a limo going through downtown Manhattan with Bill Crystal, one of the architects of the slaughter of the Iraqi people. And, what was most shocking about it is that Fat Joe still exists. I really miss Big Pun, but Fat Joe was a terrible
R.I.P. Big
rapper.
Pun. So I'd love to hear from people like Naomi Klein. I mean, what it was that kept them silent on this issue. I mean, and maybe there's an argument that I'm missing. Like tactically, if you're, involved in a certain issue, like in her case, it's climate change. Like, do you not want to get drawn into it's just like a toxic issue and feel like it's just not worth the energy? I mean, I could understand if there's some kind of, or at least I could entertain, I think seriously discuss a tactical argument, but I just love to hear what it is, and I do want to point out that there has been an incentive structure for conformity, like as illustrated by the behavior of outlets like The Intercept, which Naomi writes for, because they have Glenn Greenwald, and Glenn is like among the first to push back, and he's done obviously among the best work, if not the best. But I mean, the rest of the site, they hired James Risen, who is peddling this constantly. They published that awful not phony, but really shaky story based on Reality Winner's leaked NSA document, or claiming to show a Russian effort to hack into U.S. voting systems, and they got it totally wrong. As if you haven't seen it, you can see my interview with James Risen of The Intercept, where he hangs up on me when I press him to actually discuss the contents of the document that their entire article and argument was based on. Betsy Reed, the editor of The Intercept, took what I took to be a shot at me in a profile of Glenn Greenwald in The New Yorker, where she basically said that people like me, although she didn't name me, were a pale imitation of Glenn Greenwald and dissed Russia skeptics on the left, because she said that Robert Mueller has already shown us that there's a connection between Trump and the Russians. So I'd love to know what was going on there. What was the thinking? What were the incentives to either stay quiet or even to buy into it?
There wasn't much thinking. There was also a lot of feeling, and we have to go back to that moment when Trump won and all these people were crying, and Virginia Heffernan was writing on Lena Dunham's blog about how she loves Hillary Clinton. She's actually emotionally in love with Hillary Clinton. And, Keith Olbermann comes out in his cardboard set in his basement and starts screaming that everyone who denies that Russia controls Donald Trump is a traitor and should basically be sent to the gulag.
Russian scum.
Russian scum. Scum! Russian scum!
It's the liberal Alex Jones.
We are at war with Russia. Or perhaps more correctly, we have lost a war with Russia without a battle. We are no longer a sovereign nation. We are no longer a democracy. We are no longer a free people. We are the victims of a bloodless coup. So far, a bloodless coup engineered by Russia with, at best, the traitorous indifference of the Republican Party and Donald John Trump, a man who, to borrow a phrase from another December long ago, will live in infamy. The nation and all of our freedoms hang by a thread, and the military apparatus of this country is about to be handed over to scum who are beholden to scum. Russian scum! This is a reality that will become the only reality until this country rids itself of Donald John Trump. He is not a president. He is a puppet put in power by Vladimir Putin. And those who ignore these elemental existential facts, Democrats or Republicans, are traitors to this country and will immediately and forever after be held accountable.
He's back at ESPN or something. There's no accountability. But, there was this crazy moment when people were just so shocked and they thought that, Nazism was sweeping the land, and that, Trump minions were calling in death threats to Jewish community centers. And it turned out it was an Intercept reporter and a Jewish kid from Israel who were doing it. There was remember that crazy moment? I think that affected people completely across progressive media, and it was hard for them to keep their heads, especially if they didn't have a solid anti-imperialist analysis. They didn't understand what the intelligence agencies are capable of doing. They didn't see what was before their eyes. And so I think it really sorted out the wheat from the chaff. And here we are. And these people want us to forget that they fell for this and got swept up in the frenzy of the resistance and opened the door for a gigantic disinformation operation that brought us deeper into a new Cold War.
In terms of the psychological dimension here, what Max is talking about is how people were vulnerable and looking for answers after Trump won. I mean, if you're a part of the political media class, I don't think it's really... it's forgivable, but it needs to be reckoned with, because it's our job to follow the facts and to think seriously about both what journalism is and what politics are. So I think there needs to be a reckoning. But if you're not in media or politics and you don't have the time to be reading all the information, to be following everything, and you rely on the media and your politicians to give you the important information and a factual rendering of what the evidence is, I don't blame you at all, because this was forced on everybody, and there was no alternative. You had to search for it. There was us and a handful of others who were pushing back and doing what we could to look at the available evidence. But it just the prevailing narrative across the media, and that's why it's important to mention places like Democracy Now! And The Intercept and some of my colleagues at The Nation and The Young Turks who got this so wrong, is because even on the left there just wasn't a place to get a pushback, to get an accurate narrative, and so I totally get why anybody who is not whose job it is not to be looking at information to buy into this because they had no other alternative, and everybody was in pain and scared about Trump winning. And so this idea of, well, Trump is actually a Kremlin conspirator and the Saint Robert Mueller is going to save the day and end our nightmare, it's very comforting and very appealing. So why wouldn't you believe that?
Yeah. I think that now that we're here at this kind of pivotal moment, we've passed through a very dark era, very anti-progressive era in American politics, and we're going to enter something probably crazier. But just for us three and those who were kind of in the trenches with us through this dark period, I think the attacks are going to increase. And I think the target on our back has expanded for being right and for kind of rubbing it in a little bit on this issue. And so I'm expecting to be attacked more harshly in the coming months and, all the way through 2020. Partly because, there won't be accountability in the press, and they're circling the wagons right now, and then they're going to come up with a new narrative to hit us. And Venezuela is a perfect example of how things get misreported and will continue to be misreported. I mean, you just have one fake story after another tumbling out of the New York Times. The media has just completely shifted in this era. I mean, it's been happening for a while. It's no longer journalism. It's no longer news. It is an information war. And this country's in a Cold War. And people who work for the New York Times, who cover international issues, or who often work in, progressive circles, they do see themselves in an information war, and they feel a certain obligation to present this country's interests in their work, and to tell and to act as kind of stenographers for the national security state.
Yeah, and this is the crucial point. It's that this information war already exists regardless of whether or not you want it to exist. The U.S. government is saying this very explicitly. The U.S. government is apportioning a lot of money, many millions of dollars, to fund information warfare, especially in other countries, but you can bet that they're doing it here as well.
But domestic propaganda, I mean, new knowledge, we talked about that. We are facing a tidal wave of domestic state propaganda being rolled out through various private cutouts, and people don't understand that that's what's happening, and that's what Russiagate was and will continue.
And the thing about new knowledge, I'm glad you brought it up again, because I was going to make the point. They called their operation a Russian style disinformation operation. Actually, it was a CIA style disinformation operation. And I was going to point out there's a long history throughout the Cold War, but still today, of the NED and USAID doing the same kind of disinformation ops in other parts of the world. And domestically, we know, thanks to incredible reporting, especially, I recommend this book like every episode we do, but The Cultural Cold War by Francis Stoner Saunders looks at how these ostensibly socialist, progressive, anti-communist magazines were funded by CIA front groups. There was this entire cultural, political, artistic apparatus built up as part of information warfare during the Cold War. And there were a lot of well-intentioned people who were unwitting pawns in those disinformation operations, in the information warfare. And the point I was just making a second ago, the information warfare exists whether you like it or not. It's a fact of the world we live in today. So it's not a matter of, oh, do you support it? It's like, no, it's happening, and you need to understand where your positioning is in it. Because if you don't push back against it, you're going to be, once again, one of those unwitting pawns, like many well-intentioned people were during the 60s, 70s, even into the 80s.
So Aaron, I mean, we started doing that at The Real News. We just started having these regular conversations about Russiagate and unpacking it as an information war on the minds of Americans. And then you kind of took the ball and ran with it, just doing every week a new piece, taking down the Russiagate narrative at The Nation, and just chipping away. And now here you are, kind of taking a victory lap. But what's next? I mean, how do you approach this next? And what's your advice for other reporters, especially younger reporters who are breaking in, on how to approach the politics we're in?
Well, it's tough because especially if you're trying to do this as a trade, right? There will be continued incentives to sell out. There is a material benefit if you peddle the party line. And unfortunately, I think we saw many friends and colleagues and others buy into that. So I mean, it's like you just know that if you're getting into journalism, you're up against that. And if you have integrity and if you stick to the facts, there's no guarantee that is going to work out. That's just a sad fact. But so it's a question of making your own choices and coming to your own conclusions based upon a realistic look at the system in which you operate. It's just that sad. On the issue of like taking a victory lap, I want to say it's hard not to right now when the same people who got it so wrong are refusing to take accountability. And not only that, are attacking those who got it right. So we've all experienced that on Twitter in recent days, and I'm sure we'll continue to. So it's like, it's not about gloating right now. And there's nothing to gloat over. Because again, as we've stressed and we've been warning about, this is all a massive victory for Donald Trump. And those who have been attacking us were the ones who helped hand it to him. So, in terms of where this goes forward, I mean, we're lucky that we have the platform that we have, and we'll just continue to do what we can do, which is follow the facts and be actual journalists. And I can tell you personally, it's very rewarding just to know that I stood by the facts and I wasn't intimidated, I wasn't bullied into peddling what I knew was bullshit. I mean, although it wasn't hard because this whole thing, it's like it just like. I was like, it was crazy to me throughout this to be like marginalized and to be mocked and attacked by people who consider themselves to be serious, because it's not like I'm arguing some complex like political theory, like I'm some like ideologue. I was rejecting the idea that there was a conspiracy between Trump and the Russian government, and rejecting the idea that these juvenile social media posts were a massive threat to the U.S. or he even had like a remote impact on the election. So this is a case where those who had integrity were shown to be right, and hopefully others who had no integrity or who forgot about their integrity will follow suit. But of course, there's no guarantee of that. And as we made clear, there are incentives to keep doubling down and to ignore what we've just been through and to keep on parroting the establishment line.
Well, the line now is to release the report, and I just want to say I hope, Aaron, that you'll continue to release reports.
I definitely will, and I can't wait for the report. I just don't think those who are calling for it from the pro-Russiagate side realize what they're in for.
Well, there's going to be a lot, I think, about Israel, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia in that report, and that might be what is looming around the corner. I mean, who do you think who do you think was up in Jared Kushner's WhatsApp groups?
Yeah, and on the subject, this is the best take ever published on Russiagate. It was published in the foreword in December 2017. This is the headline. Jared Kushner was right to collude with Russia because he did it for Israel. By Daniel Cohn. That is a real article. Jared Kushner was right to collude with Russia because he did it for Israel.
That's crazy, and that's a great way to go out.
Well, one final note. This is what we've been saying, not just since Trump was elected, but since before Trump was elected. And it was always that the best way to attack Trump is from the left, not the right. We saw this during the presidential campaign where Bernie Sanders was consistently polling double digits above Trump, whereas Clinton and Trump were very close in the polls. And we kept saying it when Trump was elected, that the best way to attack him is from the left. But Russiagate was always a tactic to attack Trump from the right. Mm-hmm. It was a way to move Trump further to the right, to prevent any kind of anti-interventionist policies, to make sure that he sticks with the foreign policy consensus. And it was also a way for neoliberal Democrats and their corporate Wall Street donors to prevent any movement to the left. And once again, these corporate neoliberal Democrats have given a gift to Trump, as they did when they destroyed Bernie Sanders' campaign, and they're going to continue doing it again and again and again, which is why we need to continue to stress that the best way to attack Trump, the only effective way to attack Trump, is not from the right with this stupid xenophobia against whatever boogeyman like Russia or China or Venezuela. The best way to attack, the only way to attack Trump is to criticize him from the progressive left-wing perspective.
As illustrated by the fact, and the last thing I'll say, as illustrated by the fact that, instead of talking about healthcare for all or opposing Trump's tax cuts, this historic upward transfer of wealth to the rich, What were we talking about? You know, Paul Manafort, Michael Cohen. What were we protesting about? A bigger national protest against Trump during his presidency.
To save Mueller.
To save Mueller and spawned by the firing of Jeff Sessions. So the firing of Jeff Sessions sparked a bigger protest than did Trump's assault on healthcare and Trump's tax cut. I mean, think about that. And think about all the attention we paid to this instead of building, you know, consensus around progressive issues that could have reached people who either didn't vote or who were duped by Trump into voting for him thinking that he would drain the swamp. So this massive waste of liberal attention and energy is hopefully now, with Mueller destroying the conspiracy theory that was the basis for it, is hopefully now put to rest for good.
And the last thing I want to say is, Luke Harding, retire.
Our interview was called "Where's the Collusion?" and I think we answered that question this week.
Let's close with a clip of your interview with Luke Harding, one of the classic interviews of Russiagate.
And then he signed his email off with by saying, "Off to collect my paycheck at KGB," and then he has an emoji smiley face with 2 parentheses. Okay, and you write, "The thing which gave me pause was Kilimnik's use of smiley faces. True, Russians are big emoticon fans, but I've seen something similar before. On his Twitter feed, Nalobin described himself thus: a brutal agent of the Putin dictatorship. Smiley face." So are you inferring there that because 2 Russians used a smiley face, that's proof that Manafort's associate was a tool of the Russian government?
No, I mean, really what you're doing is now rather a sort of silly exercise. You haven't read the book, but you're taking one small bit and jumping on that.
Because you're using emoticons as proof of a Russian tie, so I'm asking you about it.
If you let me...
Okay, please, yeah.
Your kind of question, and maybe you could read the rest of the book when you finish the interview. But, I mean, this is, Kilimnik is the guy that Paul Manafort last summer emailed about trying to set up a kind of private briefing. This is when Manafort is still Trump's campaign manager for a very famous oligarch called Oleg Deripaska. Now Deripaska more or less sort of sits at the right hand of Putin. He certainly has very close relations with him. And I think it's perfectly kind of legitimate to ask what kind of Kilimnik role was, Kilimnik was playing. I emailed him. We're in kind of correspondence. He's still in contact, by the way, with Paul Manafort. Was emailing him a couple of weeks ago. Manafort I met. I mean, there's a whole chapter about what he was doing in Ukraine, about his work for Viktor Yanukovych, about how Yanukovych became a kind of, kleptocrat, and he's now been indicted with money laundering, with conspiracy against the US by Robert Mueller. So I think it's perfectly legitimate to look at him. And
I'm not saying, Luke, I'm not saying it's not legitimate. I'm taking issue with you writing, "The thing which gave me pause was Kilimnik's use of smiley faces," as if the use of smiley faces is somehow evidence of a nefarious Russian government tie. And yes, he does not like Hillary Clinton. He loathes the U.S. for many reasons, including the expansion of NATO. But I think we're conflating that with evidence and a conclusion that meant that he cultivated Trump and intervened in the election. I think those two things are different.
That's your view, and it would be great if you could go to Moscow, go to Kiev, go to the post-Soviet world, talk to people from the Russian opposition, talk to human rights activists, talk to journalists whose colleagues have been murdered, and perhaps understand a little bit better the kind of state that Vladimir Putin's Russia is. I think you'd be doing yourself a service, and you'd be doing your listeners a service.
I don't think I've countered anything you said about the state of Vladimir Putin's Russia. The issue under discussion today has been whether there was collusion, the topic of your book.
Yeah, I know, but you're clearly a kind of collusion rejectionist. I'm not kind of sure what evidence, short of Trump and Putin in the sauna together, would convince you. Clearly nothing would convince you.
But again, but again, well, look, this gets back to the issue. The question is whether there is any evidence so far, and I don't see it. And it looks like Luke has logged off. Is that true? Well, we've lost Luke Harding. I'm not sure if that was intentional or not, but regardless, we're going to wrap the interview here. The book is called Collusion, Secret Meetings, Dirty Money, and How Russia Helped Donald Trump Win. I'm Aaron Maté. Thanks for joining us